the world of politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Mathieu, in for David Weston. U.S. stocks moving higher after a rocky week as investors grapple with a hawkish Fed pivot, a host of mixed corporate earnings. There's been a lot to sift through, and the Biden administration now briefing big banks on possible Russian sanctions, hand-wringing meantime over how to fill the seat of retiring Justice Stephen Breyer. We're going to hit on all of these topics throughout the hour, but first we begin with another real-world example of our aging infrastructure. A bridge collapse in Pittsburgh on the very same day that President Biden is traveling to the city to push his economic agenda and promote the benefits of the bipartisan infrastructure law. That is where we begin now with Bloomberg Government's Emily Wilkins and Jack Fitzpatrick. Thanks to both of you for being here. Emily, how can the president use this collapse? And I want to be careful here, by the way. We should note 10 people were injured. There are no fatalities, mercifully. How does he use this to help promote the infrastructure law that he thinks not enough people have heard about?
I mean, a part of what this infrastructure law does is that it actually provides funding for bridges like this one in Pittsburgh. In fact, Pennsylvania is slated to receive $1.6 billion just from that infrastructure package alone. And that's something that Biden's going to be talking about today, just sort of emphasizing the fact that, yes, America's bridges, America's roads, America's infrastructure, many of them are in need of repairs, critical repairs, like the bridge that we've seen in Pittsburgh.
Jack, much has been said about the timeline for infrastructure investments. Will voters see actual shovels in the ground, actual projects in their neighborhoods getting underway before the midterms?
Before the midterms is a bit of a challenge. You know, a lot of the money that it was in the infrastructure bill takes a few years to get out. It's possible they could obligate some of that money and start work. If you've ever had highway work done near where you live, you know it takes a long time to actually finish projects. I would be interested to hear if the president says anything about how the executive branch will use any flexibility it has, if he's looking to increase the pace of work in Pennsylvania, for example. But, you know, for one, they can start somewhat quickly. To actually repair bridges, to get all the highway work done, is more in a 5-year timeline. So it's not a really politically expedient kind of bill. Yeah, going through 2026 here with this money, Emily. We will, however, see broadband. Is that the one tangible thing that voters will be able to see, the extension of broadband access in communities around the country?
Some of that is already in place as far as programs that are meant to be bringing broadband to some of these more rural areas. I mean, that's really the key for getting this funding from D.C. to these communities. Are there programs in place to do it? And are states and localities ready to apply for that funding and to begin to put it to use? I mean, I have heard from at least a couple lawmakers who are optimistic that maybe a few programs and projects that begin in their districts in the spring will actually, they can tie back to that infrastructure funding. Yes. But Joe, a lot of it right now really is on the messaging, and we're going to see more from President Biden. The White House has said that he's going to have a new shift in strategy, doing more of these events, going around the country, talking to sort of average Americans, if you will, and really explaining more about what is in this infrastructure package and trying to actually sell that to Americans in this midterm year.
And bringing members of Congress with him on Air Force One on some of these field trips. As we've heard, Emily Wilkins and Jack Fitzpatrick, thanks for your insights. We're going to come back to you a bit later on this hour on Balance of Power. Joining us right now is Tennessee Senator Bill Hagerty, who serves on both the Banking and Appropriations Committees. He's also former U.S. ambassador to Japan. Senator, thank you for being here. I'd like to just quickly ask you, before we get into the situation with Russia and Ukraine, about this bridge collapse today. It brings, obviously, the infrastructure law to the fore. You voted against that bill in the Senate. When you hear about stories like this today, do you regret that decision?
I certainly don't regret the decision because the bill that was presented to us had only 23% of hard infrastructure. It fell far short of paying for itself as it had been advertised. So again, adding more and more debt to the backs of our children and grandchildren, I'm for hard infrastructure. If you take into account what happened in our home state of Tennessee, we had a bridge crack in Memphis as well. Our State Department got that, our state Transportation Department got that fixed very rapidly. I hope to see that happen in Pittsburgh. You know the permitting timelines. The federal money is going to be slow to arrive.
Right.
But I hope the state will be able to get to the fore right away, and my heart goes out to those that were injured in this collapse.
Indeed. You're set to receive, I believe, $8 billion in your state through the next 5 years, through 2026. Do you plan to use that money?
Certainly. I think the state's going to do its best to try to find an appropriate way to allocate those funds to build our infrastructure. Again, I'm not against infrastructure. I just would like to see a clean bill come through that actually is paid for and doesn't have so much superfluous features to it as the one that we saw here.
Senator, Bloomberg News is reporting the Biden administration is briefing the major banks on possible sanctions against Russia. These conversations have just been underway. I wonder where you stand on this now. Is it time to sanction Russia over the standoff with Ukraine, or do you wait for Russia to make the next move?
You know, I think Russia has seen enough of rhetoric from this administration. We need to actually demonstrate our resolve. It's certainly appropriate, I think, and I would do it myself. I would go ahead and initiate sanctions now before Russia takes the next move.
How do you do it in a way that it actually hurts? Is that personally sanctioning Vladimir Putin?
There are a variety of ways to do it, whether it's personal, whether it's sanctioning industry that are in a position to feel that pain. But we need to demonstrate our resolve at this point. I think the Russians have had enough of our words. If you think about Vladimir Putin's perspective, everything's been dealt every card has been dealt in his direction this way as a face card. You look at what happened at our southern border. As soon as Biden came in, our border collapses. The policies toward energy. You've had a situation where he kills the Keystone XL pipeline and basically takes on the oil and gas industry here, raising prices of oil and gas around the globe. That benefits Russia dramatically. They're the second largest producer of energy. The START treaty negotiations, where we got nothing for it, and a 5-year extension to Putin.
Well, moving forward from here, though,
Senator, Colonial pipeline.
Would you support kicking Russia out of the SWIFT financial system? Would that actually have an impact? Some have questioned whether Vladimir Putin would actually feel that.
I think it will have a dramatic impact, certainly on industry there in Russia. That's a very big move. I know that's one that they're talking through with the banks right now, but there are a number of things that could be done. For example, imposing the sanctions for Nord Stream 2 that we've mandated through Congress and the Biden administration has waived. These are the types of things where he has the opportunity to step up and do something right now, and he should.
Senator, as I mentioned, you're on the Banking Committee. Will you vote to confirm Sarah Bloom Raskin as Vice Chair of Supervision on the Federal Reserve?
I want to have the benefit of having the hearings that are coming up first, but I'm very concerned about the rhetoric that I've heard from her in terms of contorting financial regulations to achieve certain political goals.
It's interesting, the Chamber of Commerce sent your committee a letter expressing concern about the Fed's role in regulating the climate risk. White House responded with a statement saying Bloom Raskin will work in concert with Chair Powell, quote, within the Federal Reserve's existing mandate. So where's the problem?
Well, the problem would be in what we've seen from writings from a number of people in the Biden administration, their willingness to actually somehow define the regulatory construct to bring into account, climate regulation. We saw it with Operation Choke Point in the Obama-Biden administration. We've seen them show their willingness to use financial regulations as a means to accomplish political objectives, and that's not appropriate.
Well, we're talking confirmation hearings, Senator. There's another big one coming, and that's for a Supreme Court nominee. Yeah. I realize the president has not named that individual yet, but we are already hearing some pushback from Republicans. I wonder if you will make an effort to slow that process.
I think the Biden administration and the Democrats are seeing the same polling that I'm looking at, and that is that they're going to lose the Senate in November. So they've rushed and pushed Breyer out. We'll see what type of candidate they put forward, but I can assure you of this. Whatever candidate they bring forward, I'm going to be looking for someone who's going to interpret the Constitution as it was written, not how they think it ought to be written. I'm not looking for someone that's going to legislate from the bench. I'm going to look for someone that will interpret the law.
Mm-hmm. Do you support the president's intention, as he stated yesterday, to nominate a woman of color, the first black woman to the Supreme Court? Do you like that idea in principle, something that you would support in the Senate?
Look, I'm not against it at all. I just want to see a qualified candidate come through. That's the most important criteria.
As a former ambassador to Japan, you supported Rahm Emanuel for ambassador. I believe you introduced him even at his confirmation hearing. How would you assess President Biden's slate of foreign policy nominees overall?
Well, with respect to Ambassador Emanuel, I doubt there's a single point of domestic policy that he and I would agree to. At the same time, we've had a situation where that seat has been open for 2 years, far too long. one of the most critical ambassadorships in the world. If you think about where Japan is situated, the third largest economy in the world after the U.S. and China. We have more military stationed there than any place else in the world, and it's a very tough neighborhood. China right at your doorstep, North Korea and Russia. We need somebody there, and I'm confident that Ambassador Emanuel is going to advance America's interests.
More broadly, Senator, President Biden promised to reestablish our alliances. He says America is back on the global stage. Is he right?
I don't know where he gets this rhetoric, because America had come back strong in the previous administration. President Trump was for America and putting our interest first and foremost.
Has he fallen short of that goal then?
President Biden has demonstrated a policy of appeasement. If you look at what's happening with respect to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, every one of them has stepped up their aggressive activities. After the fall of Afghanistan, we've just emboldened our allies. Emboldened our adversaries even more, and we've made our allies more concerned about our resolve.
What would not feel like appeasement then? Do you move in the 8,500 troops into Eastern Europe now?
No, I think the sanctions is the more appropriate way to go. That's what the discussions are underway right now. That's what I should have, I should have hoped to have seen from the Biden administration much earlier than this. Yeah. But again, they need to move now to demonstrate our resolve before Russia takes action, rather than wait till after it's happened.
Senator Bill Hagerty, Republican from Tennessee, we thank you for your time today on Bloomberg. Coming up, we talk supply chains and global competition with Michigan Representative Haley Stevens. It's still ahead. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu, in for David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
Joe, thank you. Bloomberg has learned the Biden administration held discussions with the country's largest banks on possible sanctions against Russia. This week, members of the National Security Council and other senior administration officials spoke with executives from banks including Citigroup, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Goldman Sachs. Tensions have soared after Russia amassed tens of thousands of troops on Ukraine's border. Officials in Moscow have repeatedly said they have no intention of invading the country. At least 10 people are injured after a major bridge in Pittsburgh collapsed. It happened just hours before President Biden's scheduled visit to the city. He'll discuss his signature bipartisan infrastructure law. None of the injuries is life-threatening, according to Pittsburgh Mayor Ed Gainey. Today, thousands of New York City police officers are paying their final respects to 22-year-old fellow officer Jason Rivera at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Rivera and his partner, Officer Wilbert Mora, were fatally shot last week after responding to a family dispute. Mora's funeral is next week. More than 18,000 flights have been canceled as the east coast of the United States braces for a powerful winter storm. Forecasters say as much as 10 inches of snow could fall across New York City, while eastern Long Island and Boston could see 18 inches. Washington may pick up a few inches this afternoon, but it will miss the heart of the storm. The blizzard is expected to intensify so rapidly that it could become a so-called bomb cyclone. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Mark, thank you. Global competition and supply chain bottlenecks are high on the legislative agenda in the weeks ahead. And joining us now to discuss this, Michigan Representative Haley Stevens, a key voice in pulling together the America Competes Act, which aims to strengthen U.S. innovation. And that's where we begin our conversation. Congresswoman, thank you for being here. We learned this week from the Commerce Department that the chip shortage will last longer than thought, likely straight through this year. CEO Jim Farley at Ford says that's what he's looking at as well, that it's on to next year already. I know this is a critical issue for Detroit, for your constituents. What is taking so long for the House to pass that bill, which contains the CHIP Act?
Well, you're spot on. I was just with a supplier yesterday, Aptiv, talking about the chip crisis, asking them how they were feeling, and they were already projecting this to go into 2023. And we know that the CHIPS Act legislation, which I'm so pleased is in the Competes Act, which has gotten introduced. I'm racing to get back to Washington, despite the snow for next week, so that we can vote on this and get this done. But I'll tell you, it's not going to be wave the wand. and solve the problem overnight. This has got to be a midterm solution that we also need to develop long-term solutions for as well. I don't want foreign competitors dictating our strategy.
Mm-hmm.
What I do want is American manufacturing coming back here. We invented these chips. We should be making them here.
It's kind of a reality check, though, when you consider the length of time. And you and I have talked about this frequently, which increases the urgency, I know, to pass this legislation. It could take years for a foundry to be built and actually start manufacturing and shipping computer chips. So what makes you think we're not going to be talking about this for the next 5 years? Why would it get better next year?
Well, look, Congresswoman Haley Stevens has been talking about this for the last 5 years, and I expect to be working on it for 5 years to come. This is decades of disinvestment. This is decades of losing our chip manufacturing production here in the United States.
Yeah.
So we've got to be honest with people. This is why I go out and meet with small businesses. I meet with workers. I've got my finger on the pulse of this. This is, why in 2019 I was saying, hey, I'm a semiconductor enthusiast. I want to bring attention to
So
this
will it
industry.
take decades to solve, though, is the question.
We should hope not, right? We've just seen Intel make a big investment. We've got a lot of head into Ohio, our neighbor to the south here, but hey, it's in the Midwest. I know our governor here in Michigan is working on recruiting companies, and our companies, look, particularly in automotive,
Mm-hmm.
they have gone through tough times. They have been through downturns. They have gone through the brink. We saw a lot of consolidation during the Great Recession. And so they're managing through this. But if we fail to act, which I don't think we will, but if we fail to act, that's going to be a real problem.
Well, what are you hearing from leadership? What's the timeline on this? Do you have a reasonable expectation that this gets done in the coming months?
Well, look, I was pushing on this all last year. So, the year came to an end. We reconvened at the top of this year for the second half of our legislative session. I was really pleased to hear leadership talking about chips, really understanding it.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard the words come out of the mouth, and now we've got the legislation. So think about it. The House will take a vote projected next week on the complete version of the CHIPS Act. It gets us the special types of fabs the special type of chips for automotive. We had worked, our U.S. senators worked on that. So then there's a matter of how does this get to the president's desk for signature? And so we probably will go through a procedural process. Q1, which we're in right now, it's going to be essential. Let's get it done.
Congresswoman, Michigan is set to receive $10 billion from the infrastructure law. This has come to the fore today with news of this bridge collapse in Pittsburgh. It's something else that you've talked about quite a bit, certainly during the debate and getting that passed. Now that it is the law of the land, and the president's going to be talking about it a little bit later on today, when will we actually see projects begin? When do shovels go in the ground so we're not having more stories like this one?
Well, I'm meeting on a regular basis with all of my municipal leaders in southeastern Michigan and in Oakland County, getting them ready for the utilization of those dollars that will come via the federal government to the state level. People are excited about electric vehicle charging infrastructure. All my mayors here in automotive land are talking about that, but also for roadway improvements and the like. And so let's move, because it's coming through to the state level, and we should expect to see some projects starting this year at minimum. I know
this year. So before the midterm elections, your constituents will start seeing construction projects underway.
Yeah. And get people to work, right? We've got these projects identified. Water, clean water is a big deal. Getting the lead out of our pipelines. This is a big challenge for us in Oakland County. We're working on that as well. Water affordability, as well as roadway maintenance, bridge repair. Obviously, very ironic and frankly quite heartbreaking to see a bridge fall in Pittsburgh today. 10 injuries. Indeed. Hopefully everyone survives, no lives are lost, but this is a wake-up moment for us.
The images are disturbing. Representative Haley Stevens, we thank you for your time today on Bloomberg. Coming up, the U.S. dollar stronger for a fifth consecutive day. Shares of Apple are surging on the heels of quarterly earnings, beat targets, and we'll have more on the markets ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu, in for David Weston. A wild week for the markets, coming to a close. Welcome to Friday. The S&P 500 skirting correction territory, and we want to bring in Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta for more on the markets. It's been exhausting following this. I can't imagine what your week has been like. You can't even talk about the markets by the day. It's by the hour. What's happening this hour?
It really is by the hour. Well, right now you're actually seeing a pretty strong rebound. A lot of this is led by tech and, of course, by Apple in particular. We got to talk about the earnings story here because the two major risk events this week were first the Fed on Wednesday, but then, of course, those Apple earnings last night. And you did see Apple come out with a pretty strong beat on their earnings. They also said they were able to navigate those supply chain issues in a way that a lot of other companies weren't able to. And that's going to be a really key part of that earnings story. I'm just going to run through a couple more and show you just the divergence that you're seeing from company to company. Visa also coming out with some very strong consumer spending data in particular, showing you that the consumer is, at the end of the day, pretty strong. But then you have those companies where the supply chain costs are actually eating into the bottom line. Chevron is a great example where they're also dealing with old aged wells that are eating into the profits that higher energy prices would traditionally afford them. Caterpillar also dealing with, once again, the supply chain issues. They have a great backlog. The demand's there. The supply isn't.
How about that? And this was supposed to be boom time for Caterpillar because of the infrastructure law we've been spending some time on this hour.
Yeah, the classic play, right? The Build Back Better play. A lot of that was priced into industrial stocks in particular, which Caterpillar is kind of the poster child for. I'm looking at a pretty big a backlog order here. It rose 64% in the last quarter, and they're really just not able to make good on that simply because of the supply chain issues. With
regard to Chevron, we're talking $100 a barrel oil at some point, possibly this year. Does that pull them out of their issues or recover from this quarter?
In theory, I mean, you had the CEO on Bloomberg TV earlier, and he said, well, $100 oil is 100% a possibility. And he would be joining calls over at, say, Goldman Sachs, for example, which is saying $101 for NYMEX crude potentially soon. And so this isn't a call that's particularly, counter consensus. But once again, it's going to be, can they actually be profitable on that, especially for those domestic energy consumers, or producers, I should say, that are still dealing with a lot of that capital discipline issues.
Just quickly, has Apple figured out the chip shortage in a way other companies have not?
Well, their supply chains extend farther. They also have multiple suppliers, and they're also probably one of the biggest consumers for a lot of these major companies. So in a way, they kind of get that first priority, so they are able to navigate them, but it doesn't mean that they're not getting hit. They're just a little more insulated than other companies.
Being rewarded for it today.
Certainly.
Thanks to Kriti Gupta. As always, coming up, the Biden administration briefing Wall Street over possible sanctions on Russia. More on that conversation next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu, in for David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we now go to Mark Crumpton. Mark?
Joe, thank you. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the Western alliance has increased the readiness of its response force over the past weeks and is considering adding battle groups in the Black Sea region. He says that NATO is working hard for the best peaceful political solution, but is also prepared for the worst.
From the NATO side, we are ready to engage in political dialogue, but we're also ready to respond if Russia chooses an armed conflict.
Secretary General Stoltenberg adds that the NATO allies are ready to impose heavy economic sanctions on Russia. And he adds that Russia, meanwhile, has denied it intends to invade its neighbor despite massing thousands of troops, tanks, and equipment near Ukraine's eastern border. North Korea has now confirmed that it's launched 4 missiles this week. The test included the launch of 2 long-range cruise missiles that could give Kim Jong-un's regime the ability to hit almost all of Japan. Kim has ramped up weapons testing in an effort to signal unhappiness with the United States over economic sanctions. The UK will start giving Pfizer's pill to vulnerable people next month, rolling out a treatment that could save thousands of deaths linked to the pandemic. And a drug developed by Merck showed activity against Omicron in 6 lab studies, raising confidence in the ability of the new therapy to battle the variant. It will take Hong Kong at least 6 weeks to vaccinate 90% of its population if the current pace holds. This means it could be the middle of March before the city could start easing restrictions, such as those on restaurants, bars, and gyms. Meantime, Germany's 7-day rate of infections rose to an all-time high. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Mark, thank you. A few signs of easing tensions between the U.S. and Russia amid the ongoing standoff at the Ukrainian border, sources telling Bloomberg News. The Biden administration has been holding discussions now with the country's largest banks on possible sanctions against Russia as part of an effort to minimize disruption to the global financial system. And back with us to talk about it, our panelists, Bloomberg Government's Emily Wilkins and Jack Fitzpatrick. Thanks to both of you for being back. Jack, you heard Senator Hagerty, Republican from Tennessee, on the program a bit earlier this hour say, what are we waiting for? It's time to put sanctions in place now. Are we hearing more calls for that action on Capitol Hill?
Well, we already had heard that kind of call when Republicans and even some Democrats kind of got ahead of this, pushing for a resumption of the Nord Stream 2 sanctions. So there's been kind of a long-running, at least 6-month debate on Capitol Hill about whether to impose sanctions on Russia, and then some pushback from the Biden administration effectively saying if they have a carrot and stick conversation with Russia about a possible invasion of Ukraine, moving early with any sanctions more or less takes away the carrot. Yeah. So there's been some resistance by the Biden administration, even in the face of, at times, bipartisan support for a more aggressive and preemptory stance on sanctioning Russia.
Yeah, Emily, the Ted Cruz Nord Stream 2 bill that I think Jack is referring to went down over concerns that we were not, at least White House concerns, that we were not factoring in our European allies. Senator Menendez has been promising the mother, I think, as he calls it, of all sanctions bills. Where does that stand? Are we going to see some momentum on that legislation?
Well, lawmakers have definitely been working on that, Joe. They're not in Washington this week. They were scheduled to be back in their districts, which is where they are. But there's still been discussions going on about what sanctions need to be put on Russia and when. A lot of senators don't want to wait for Russia to invade Ukraine. They want to have the sanctions now. So we're looking at financial sanctions. One thing that we're now hearing that the White House is potentially discussing, one thing they discussed with those banks, is potentially putting sanctions on Russia that would make it more difficult for them to convert their currency. They're looking at that option over options such as cutting Russia off from the SWIFT banking program, which some described as a nuclear option.
Yeah, and that was something that Senator Hagerty supported, Jack. When you consider this whole conversation, though, about sanctions, how much does Capitol Hill actually have to do with that? Is this not the business of the Treasury?
Much of this comes down to the Treasury. Congress can force the administration's hand, which is why there's been that conversation about the Nord Stream 2 sanctions. Congress can take legislative action to force the administration to put sanctions on there. But the I guess, crafting of the look and feel of what sanctions in the near term in a much more dynamic way that's involved with these conversations with Russia and Ukraine does usually come down to the executive branch, and that's really where the focus is going to be over the next month or so.
Seeing great reporting on this on the terminal from Emily Wilkins and Jack Fitzpatrick. Thanks to both of you. We'll be back with Jack and Emily a little bit later on this hour. I want to deepen this conversation a bit, though, and go to Frank Wisner, an international affairs advisor at Squire Patton Boggs, former U.S. ambassador to Zambia, Egypt, the Philippines, and India. Ambassador, we're hearing the Pentagon say they're considering moving troops in Eastern Europe. We're hearing the White House suggest that an attack from Russia could be imminent. Is it time to start taking action now and not waiting for Russia to cross the border?
First of all, I'm delighted to be with you today. It's a dramatic moment for all of us. That said, I believe this crisis has reached a point in which politics and negotiations should take precedence over threats and military action. That does not mean that it isn't wise to take precautionary action, position forces, plan very carefully the use of sanctions. But the priority should be to pursue political outcomes. And there are two on the table. The first is the direct dialogue between the United States and NATO on the one hand, with the Russian government, and second, the European reach to the Normandy group and Ukraine and the Russians to begin to de-escalate or find ways to de-escalate the crisis with Ukraine. Let's remember, this crisis with Ukraine is 20 years in the making.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a long time in the unmaking. But we need to be patient, persistent, smart, be ready, but at the same time, open to finding a political outcome.
Would imposing sanctions on Russia right now simply trigger Vladimir Putin to be more aggressive?
I think it's the wrong move. It's got the smell of politics behind it in this country, as opposed to smart diplomacy and statecraft. The way to proceed now is to engage the Russians and begin to see if we can move towards a security architecture in Europe for the next stage that will be sustainable. Let's remember, there was Yalta, there was the end of the Cold War. We're at a new phase. We're going to have to find a way through this phase and find a way to secure and strengthen Ukraine's independence.
Yeah.
That can only be done politically.
We tend to focus on the risks in these conversations, Frank, the things that can go wrong. You were suggesting maybe some things could go right here. What's the exit strategy? If diplomacy is the answer, what is the exit strategy for Vladimir Putin? Or has he simply pushed it too far to turn around?
No, he has not pushed it too far. He's a great gambler, and he leaves himself many exit ramps. What he is trying to accomplish is to weaken the Ukrainian state and bring it into Russia's sphere of influence on the one hand, and on the other, to signal very clearly that the gains that he perceives the West and the United States achieved with the Cold War, that's enough. Stop and reverse. Reduce the armaments threats to Russia as he describes them, over-describes them, the threats of the advance of NATO eastward towards Russia's borders.
Yeah.
So his objective is to readjust the balance of power in Europe, to steal the name of your show.
Frank, looking back, I like that. That's pretty good. Back on the domestic politics of this country, to what extent is political division in the U.S. emboldening Vladimir Putin at this time?
That's an extremely important question. And I think he's tested his luck with 5 American presidents. He doesn't think we have steady policies. We reverse course. So he can push on us. He's got the sad example of Afghanistan recently behind us. He sees the partisan divide in this country. These are all strengths or weaknesses on our side that he plays to. He's built a strong alliance with China, unfortunately to our disadvantage. So he strengthened his own hand, and he exploits what he perceives as our weaknesses.
Lastly, Frank,
we have lots of cards to play, so we don't have to cavil to his pressure.
well, if one of those cards is in fact sanctions, if that's the route that we take, is it possible to have effective sanctions against Russia without harming our European allies?
There is a necessity. If Putin engages in military action, I find we have adequate agreement with our European friends to stand up to that kind of military action.
Yeah.
Europe would clearly prefer us taking advantage of the negotiating options. We want to stick with Europe. Part of our strength is the Atlantic Alliance. Part of our strength are bilateral ties with European states. So we're stronger looking at Putin with allies than without.
Frank Wisner, we thank you for your time today on Bloomberg. Coming up, we turn to Europe. The Italian government in limbo as lawmakers hunt for a successor to their president. Still haven't figured that out, and we'll have more ahead. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu, in for David Weston. Italian lawmakers are voting today on a new president. They've been working on this since Monday. And we want to go to Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua in Rome right now. Francine, thanks for your reporting on this. Day 5 and still no outcome. Why not?
So day 5 and we're still counting. I have to say at this point, we have 1,000 lawmakers. We thought we'd have a name. We thought they would be able to find a consensus candidate, and it's not the case. Now, why not? It's because there's a lot of parties, Joe. The parties do not get along. They can't seem to find a name. And you have to remember that now it actually goes also to the fragility of the government. So it's complicated, but this is the way the Italian electoral system works. You have a prime minister in charge of the government, and then you have the head of state, which is basically the president of the republic. It's largely ceremonial, but this is someone with quite a lot of power in times of crisis. And so it's a fixed term for 7 years. And it gets voted in a very murky way. A lot of the analysts I've spoken to, look, this is a little bit papal. You don't know who the candidates are. You don't know the backstories and the backstreet negotiations amongst the parties. And it's day 5. We're expecting another 2 votes tomorrow, which means that there is appetite to get it moving. But at the moment, it just seems deadlock.
Will there be votes every day until there's an outcome, Francine?
Yeah, so it's unclear actually if they'll vote on Sunday. This would be quite unusual, but we have understood from, party heads that they really are keen to push this through and try and get a name. Now, the way it works was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you had a vote where you needed 75% of lawmakers to vote behind one single candidate. Yesterday, it was only 50%. Today was 50%, and then we found out this morning that they would do 2 votes. Tomorrow, we're also expecting 2 votes, and they continue to vote, Joe, until there's a name that crops up. Now, when you speak to, again, a lot of insiders, the question is whether Mario Draghi, former ECB president, and now the prime minister, will get the presidential nomination, which would leave a vacuum and an empty seat in government. With every day that passes, the jury is out on whether it strengthens his case because he could unite the parties, or whether with every day that passes, he's further away from that goal of becoming president of the republic because there are just not enough votes to support him.
Francine, while you're there, I just would love to ask you about this phone call between some business executives, business leaders in Italy and Vladimir Putin this week. Some concerns here in the U.S. about where exactly Italy stands on this.
Yeah, first of all, Joe, I have to apologize because it's extremely noisy behind me. I am right next to the Campidoglio, and there's a pretty big protest, actually, of students because of work conditions when they go into the workplace.
Understood.
But also in certain apprenticeships. Now, on the question with Vladimir Putin, this has been the one thing that everyone's been talking about. Because, Joe, if you look at the European allies, Germany is very reluctant to actually have a very strong line against Putin because they're very dependent on Russian gas. Italy is probably the second country in Europe that's most dependent on that. And also historically, there have been some very strong links between Russia and Italy that was cemented under Silvio Berlusconi. So the question, if you look at the numbers, trade has increased, I think, some 54% in the last quarter between the two countries. And Italy has also sold 20% more products to Russia. I'm talking about pasta, automobiles. And so it was very clear when Vladimir Putin showed up on Wednesday in a teleconference call with a lot of chief executives that he was trying to splinter the allies. I think it was a clear message to the government saying, you want to sanction me, but I have your chief executives on my side because they want to sell to my Russian citizens.
Multiple political stories developing in Italy, and our thanks to Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua in Rome. Coming up, our panel is back. We'll look at what's on Congress's agenda as lawmakers come back to D.C. next week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu, in for David Weston. We reassemble our panel now. Our 2 reporters, Emily Wilkins and Jack Fitzpatrick, who cover Washington, Capitol Hill specifically as we prepare for next week, the return of lawmakers and the resumption of challenges facing the administration in this relationship with Capitol Hill. Emily, you cover the leadership. What are they saying about the first order of business? Is it crafting a budget?
So the budget is definitely something that they're going to have to continue to work on next week because they're heading towards that February 18th deadline where they either need to move a budget or the government's going to shut down. But really, the big thing next week is the U.S.-China competitive bill in the House that's called the Competes Act. Remember, the Senate has already passed their version. The House is gearing up to pass theirs next week, at which point it's going to go into conference. You know, the Senate bill, it did have bipartisan support. That is not looking likely for the House bill. You've seen a number of Republicans already come out against the measure. Actually, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo has been calling Republicans, trying to get them on board for the bill or asking them at the very least if they could not publicly be opposed to it. I think the key thing to remember, though, here is that whatever the House winds up passing in this next week, that's not going to be the final bill that lands on Biden's desk. It still has the way to go.
Jack, you specialize in appropriations. What is the process? Where does it stand right now as we head for this deadline on February 18th for government funding? Do you expect another kick the can as a continuing resolution, or might there actually be a concerted effort to pass an omnibus bill?
There has been a concerted effort. They, I would say, are essentially facing a soft deadline sometime around now, maybe over the next week. As you heard, the actual deadline to fund the government is February 18th. If they are going to have an omnibus spending bill signed into law by then, they need to answer the basic questions that they've been debating for weeks. They haven't come to an agreement on just how much money to give the military, how much to do on non-defense and other key questions. If they could strike that basic deal over the next week or so, they may have an opportunity to turn it into the full bill and move that through by February 18th. I have heard mentions from lawmakers and other observers that we're around the time when they may have to have another short-term stopgap, even if things go well, because it is pretty tight. So over the course of the next week, we may get some news on how much progress they've made, how close they are to an actual deal, and whether it's even possible to meet that February 18th deadline.
Let's get into that for a minute, Emily. Will that be an opportunity if they actually get that done, to use that budget, that omnibus bill, as a vehicle to pass anything that might be left over from Build Back Better, from the president's own economic agenda?
I mean, to a certain extent, potentially, but I think for the most part, Democrats are seeing the push for Build Back Better as somewhat separate from the budget, just because there's still so much to be done. Senator Joe Manchin said he wants to start from scratch on that legislation. They still have the reconciliation process, which allows them to move it through with only Democratic votes. You can't do that with the budget process. And so I think there is separate conversations happening as far as funding the government and trying to see what, if anything, from that Build Back Better package can go through. And you've heard Democrats say they're fine if it's slimmed down. They just want to be able to go back to the American people during the midterms and say, hey, we were able to pass this, this, and this, and you'll be benefiting from it.
Jack, nobody's talking about a shutdown at this stage, right?
No, not yet. The question is, if they fail, do they end up having to use a full year stopgap measure? That it would be really bad, according to every lawmaker in both parties I've talked to. For one, that effectively it would freeze defense spending, but because of changes in policy, it would equate to about a $37 billion cut for the military. It would be re-upping appropriations for things like Afghan security forces, which is money they can't actually spend now. So it would equate to not only freezing funds for the rest of the fiscal year, but cutting it. Neither side seems to want that either. The question is, do they kick the can for so long that they get near the end of this fiscal year and they can't even give themselves time to spend the money? So nobody's talked about a shutdown, but there really would be some damage in the case of a full year continuing resolution.
Important reporting from Bloomberg's Emily Wilkins and Jack Fitzpatrick. Thanks to both of you for being with us this hour. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. I'll meet you there for our second hour as we talk taxes with Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President at the National Taxpayers Union. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.